So the title of my dissertation is Paying Attention to What Matters: Individual Differences in the Neural Correlates of Spatial Selective Attention and Social and Racial Justice in STEM. Thank you all for being here. I couldn't have gotten this far without you all. Um, and it's really my pleasure to show you what I've been up to for the past few years. I'm currently speaking from Chicago, where the owners of the land are the Peoria people, among other nations. And before I talk, I'd like to honor my ancestors, the people with surnames Sias, Turner, Norwood, Glover, all the way back to a slave named Reynolds. I'd like to thank the Quassas and the people who don't even have surnames before colonization and before we even knew what a surname was. So thank you to my ancestors for getting me here. Okay, a little bit of background. This whole thing is about attention. And before I get into the agenda for the day, what is attention? In everyday life, we think of attention as a skill that's appropriate for specific contexts. For example, it could mean sustaining an effortful focus on reading something boring or writing a long dissertation. It could be hyper engaging in an addictive video game or even social media. And it can also mean having your focus pulled away from something due to an interruption or the call of a familiar name. Attention can even just mean caring for someone. And so in this dissertation, I speak about two particular types of attention. First, selective attention, which is the scientific content. And then I'll also talk about the attention that needs to be made to marginalized scholars in the academy, particularly in STEM. Can everyone hear me? Is it all good? Okay, awesome. So I'm gonna fly, let's do this. So historically, our lab studies selective attention in the auditory domain. And selective attention in this domain is our ability to parse out and maintain attention on a single sound source within a mixture of sources. So it allows us to focus on critical information. And you all have all been in this situation before. Imagine being at a crowded cocktail party, there's music playing, there's people hollering in the background, or maybe you're in a crowded classroom and you're trying to attend to the teacher. Say there's a baby crying in the background at church. So hearing in these complex sensory environments is really a competition between these multiple auditory objects. And selective attention allows us to parse out these sounds based on the different flavors of auditory features that might exist. So that can be the spatial location, the pitch of the voice, how loud they are, how much they whisper, and even semantic cues like names. So here's an example of that. Excuse me, I need to move things out of the way. Oops. So here's an example, and I'll have you all listen to this sound. There are two voices at the same time. One is kind of roboticized, and it's a deeper voice, like a lower voice. And then there's a higher pitch voice that sounds more natural. So tell me what you hear, their numbers. Tell me which numbers you hear from the robotic voice, and you can put it in the chat so that we don't have to all unmute.
3, 5, 3, 4, 3, 4, 2.
So go ahead and drop in the chat if you'd like the numbers that you heard. And if anyone wants to listen again, this time listen for the higher pitched voice and let me know what you hear there.
3, 5, 3, 4, 3, 4, 2.
So that was an example of you all using your selective attention to enhance the representation of the higher pitched voice or the lower pitched voice. The lower pitched voice was actually my committee member, Steve Colburn's phone number. So that's really cute. And then the female voice was Barb's voice, actually, saying it's hard to listen to two things at once. So you've just done selective attention. Now, spatial selective attention is a particular type of attention, and it's the focus of my dissertation. So this is when you're using spatial cues to separate attended and ignored sounds. So unlike here in a Zoom room where space is kind of flattened, either based on your headphones or your, I guess actually the Zoom app does it, makes it mono. But unlike in a Zoom room, space helps us easily distinguish sound sources and allows our cognitive control networks to enhance the representation of our object of interest. And so these skills rely on the fidelity of both peripheral and central nervous systems. In other words, an ear and brain and everything in between. It's a connection and it's a partnership. But all perception of any sensory modality is actually a balance between what we call bottom-up attentional capture and your top-down attention goals, okay? So this is a balance, a push and pull between these two systems. So how salient is the information coming in and how much do you want to pay attention to it? And individuals actually greatly differ in their ability to perform these tasks due to just differences in top-down control. And some people really struggle in these sensory environments. You can think automatically about the aging population or people who have some type of cognitive disorder. So, just to reemphasize, the strength of top down attention varies from person to person, and this results in individual differences in selective attention ability. So, let's talk a little bit more about individual differences. Studying these differences in cognition is important because honestly, everyone is unique and we all have different strengths and abilities. Certainly, reducing cognitive functioning into mutually exclusive groups of mental illness or mental wellness has helped countless people who suffer because we've been able to create diagnoses and rehabilitation, pharmaceutical intervention for people who are at the far ends of those extremes. However, the root causes and specific underlying functional deficits that lead to these strict categories are often obscured or overlooked in exchange for an easy behavioral checklist of symptoms. So, we actually have a new frontier in neuroscience, I think, to identify spectra of functioning, and could lead in the long-term future to avoid over and underdiagnosing people and lead to precision medicine. And these latter two future goals actually require objective neural measures and not just check boxes going into a psychiatrist's office. So using an actual brain-derived correlate of behavior. So here are some outstanding questions that frame my whole dissertation. Oh, I'm spotlighted, okay. Are there individual differences in spatial selective attention, even in people with normal hearing and eyesight? What is the neural basis of these individual differences? Are mechanisms of selective attention different across sensory modalities? So that's between auditory and visual contexts, for example. Does weakened functioning associated with cognitive disorders like ADHD affect the ability to control selective attention? And then more specifically, punchline, we do talk about ADHD and if it affects selective attention in this controlled laboratory environment that we've created. So the agenda for today is to compare auditory and visual selective attention spatially, and compare ADHD and neurotypical adults while they're doing selective attention to see if there's some main difference. And then the part that might be a little more intriguing to some of you all because it's less sciencey, talking about increasing DEIJ in STEM education and practice. And then I'll talk about conclusions and future work and give some acknowledgements. So first, let's compare auditory and visual spatial selective attention. Whew. All right, let me slow down. Okay, the auditory and the visual system are very different from each other. So the visual system is actually good at tracking space. And so when you have your eyes, your retina is able to look out at the world and there's a grid of information. And that grid of information gets projected into the eyes and through to the brain. And there are other features in the visual space that are important. So there's space, there's color, there are edges, there are things that the brain does to make visual objects become coherent and understandable. On the other hand, the auditory system is actually really good at timing. So there are a variety of features that the auditory system uses, including spectral cues, timing, frequency, or what we would call pitch information, timbre, and a lot of these skills have to do with how precisely timed information is getting to one ear or the other. So instead of having a spatial map of everything, they're just two kind of microphones that have to take in the information, split it up based on pitch and spectral information, and then the brain computes where in space things are. So because of this, the auditory system, we can't close our ears. The auditory system is very much an automatic system. Even when you're sleeping, your brain, your ears still hear what's going on in the world. And that's really helpful for alerting us to dangers and threats. So that's how the auditory and the visual systems are inherently different. But then there are also brain networks that are engaged that are similar or different depending. So even though the mechanisms of object formation are very different between vision and audition, the neural basis of attention to a desired stimulus might actually be similar via the engagement of some type of attention network. And we know that sensory attention must at least activate primary sensory regions like the auditory cortex or the visual cortex. However, how this is done is not really well understood, and there are many candidate models of how this works. So one such example model that, again, we're not sure exactly how it works, was discovered in our lab in 2015. So shown here are our auditory and visual primary areas. So that's kind of here in the auditory cortex and the visual cortex. And then there are a set of interleaved auditory and visual regions in the frontal cortex. So the eyes are at the front of this, and this is where your ponytail would go. So our lab mates, after testing correlations in activity between these candidate regions, they found that um, visual bias regions, so the blue ones, were flexibly recruited during spatial listening. And auditory bias regions, the ones in orange or red, whatever, were recruited during temporally dynamic working memory tasks. So these two networks are organized to take advantage of the complementary strengths of vision and audition to process stimuli in either modality. So even though there's no way to know if this network is truly engaged or not, in my PhD, I still wondered if auditory and visual attention were at least using the same cognitive resources generally. And I wondered if the sharing of resources could be seen in individual differences in the neural response. I know that was a lot of background, but let's sum it up by saying spatial tasks activate visual bias regions, temporally dynamic tasks activate auditory bias regions, and we just wanted to know if there was some correspondence between auditory and visual spatial selective attention, so picking out the spatial aspect. So, glad you all are still with me. We created homologous auditory and visual selective attention tasks to ask the questions, will individuals perform similarly on these tasks? Will the neural correlates or the brain signatures be similar between the two? And will they maybe share the same resources or have some of the same mechanisms? I'm seeing some chats pop up, but I don't think I have time to
We're
look at
just
them.
admiring you.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's all good stuff. We'll interrupt if you need to hear something.
Thanks, Abby. From you, that's awesome. Okay, so we created two tasks. Sorry, I'm hearing my echo downstairs. It's kind of funny. Okay, so we created two complementary homologous attention tasks. So in the auditory task, each task required individuals to go into a laboratory controlled environment with a sound controlled booth. And we had people do multiple trials of the exact same experiment over and over so that we could average together their brain responses. So the auditory task comprised 3 streams of simultaneous melodies, which are depicted here in blue, gray, and red, which were spatially separated to the left, middle, or right, and they're heard through through headphones. And so subjects were cued to attend either to the left or the right, or to ignore all the streams. And then after listening to the sounds, at the end of the trial, identify if the melody that was in each stream was rising, falling, or zigzagging in pitch. So this required the subject to listen through the entire time so that they could truly use selective attention. And we staggered out the sounds to make sure that we could resolve evoked responses from EEG. And it sounded a little bit like this. So the sounds are pitch separated, and the cue that you're going to hear is a single note. It's very low. It's like kind of like boop, and it's telling you where to listen in the pitch range. So after that first beep, then all of the sounds will come on, and you should listen to the melody. Does it go up? Does it go down? Or does it zigzag in that pitch range of the cue? So first you heard the boop, and then you should have heard boop, beep, beep, beep. So I'll just do it one more time just to make sure everyone's on board. Remember, the first sound is a cue. Ooh. Yeah, so that was a rising contour, melody contour. And then we also created an analogous visual task. This always happens. We created an analogous visual task that presented arrows to the left, right, and above a central fixation dot, which was similar to the locations in the auditory task. And subjects used covert peripheral attention to monitor slight angle changes in the movement of the arrows. And they still rose, fell, or zigzag depending. And I also have a version of this to show you all too. Shout out to Laura Torres who put this together for me. Okay. So in this one, here's our fixation dot. So imagine being in a lonely sound controlled booth and you're paying attention to your eyes are fixated on the middle dot, and the cue is going to cue you to attend to the left. So around here on the screen, there'll be arrows moving up and down. And so tell me if the arrow moves falling, zigzagging, or rising. That's the cue. That was subtle, but you should have seen the arrows go middle, middle, up, up, which is a rising contour, okay? So in the interest of time, I won't repeat it, although it's gonna naturally repeat itself. Okay, let's get into the results. So here are the behavioral results. So how did the person perform on the task? And so the auditory task was much harder than the visual task. So you can see a larger spread of performance here. And lines depict individuals' subject performances connected between the two. And despite this difference in this kind of almost ceiling effect in the visual task, performance correlated between the auditory performance and the visual performance. And the RAU is a rationalized arc sign unit. It's a measure of performance level, and pi over 2 is its maximum. So that's around 1.6. So this is significant results. And it does imply that the same resources are being shared in these two different attention tasks in the different modalities. However, we're really interested in the EEG, the brain activity. So a little crash course on EEG, it picks up electrical activity from the scalp in a non-invasive, and it's a quite handy trick because we don't have to go and get an MRI, for example. So each trace of EEG depicts the activity at one of these electrodes that are placed on the scalp. And from these traces, we can calculate event-related potentials, and they look kind of like this. So these potentials are elicited by either a sudden sound or a flash of light, some type of sensory stimulus. In other words, they're potentials that are related to events, event-related potentials. So the amplitude of these, so there are these components that are stereotyped, and they're elicited after these sounds or sights. And the amplitude of these components are determined by how much attention is being paid to the evoking stimulus. So the larger, for instance, the N1 response, which we'll focus on, the larger that negativity, it's a way to quantify how much attention is being allocated to that particular stimulus, the evoking stimulus. And a little bit more information about that. Neural activity from the different sensory modalities are going to be represented differently. So just to prepare you for that, the auditory signals from the brain are generated on the side of the head, but they actually sum up to an area in the middle of the head, which my bun is right over. And left and right hemifield activity is picked up, summed up in the middle. Whereas in the visual context, they're separated out and they actually cross the brain, and they're represented in contralateral space. So that's useful to keep in mind as I show you the results. And then also we used ERPs, the event-related potentials, which is a simple mean calculation over repeated trials. But we also looked at inter-trial phase coherence, which is the mean phase consistency over trials. And it specifically takes out any magnitude information from a signal and highlights trial by trial consistency, which we assume to be, either sensory or attention related activity, the actual stimulus that we are interested in assessing. So these are the two measures that we show throughout the rest of this. Okay, so here is a reminder of, in the auditory modality, we have a sum up of left and right stimuli being represented in the center of the head. So I'm showing you three different traces representing three different attentional states. When the person attended left, attended right, and were passively attending, so they were ignoring everything. And we see these N1 negativities, so these blue, red, blue, red, blue, red, and those are being evoked from the sounds that were heard from either the left or the right when they were attending. So you can see that for that negativities evoked by the left stream, which are the blue vertical bars, are larger during the attend left condition, which is also shown in blue, and the opposite is true. The right presented onsets seen as red lines are larger. The red, oh my goodness, the attend right condition in red are enhanced after the red onsets. Later on, we utilized, oh, I'm sorry. So that's for the ERP. So that's great. And then we also saw the same type of information in the group average intertrial coherence. So these are all positive values, but again, when you have a left presented left presented sound, there's an enhancement of the attending left condition, and then same for the right. So that's awesome. It means at the group level, we're seeing that attention modulates the neural response. And then again, for the visual, we have separate left and right hemispheres to take care of. So first you see on the left hemisphere, when in the ERP, these large N1 responses, again at the group level, and they are evoked again 100 milliseconds after this eliciting sound. And through the ITCs, we see large attentional modulation. So we see these large peaks coming at around 100 milliseconds after, but with like a larger spread. Okay. I'd also just want to point out that the passive condition in this visual task has almost no bottom-up contribution. These signals aren't being amplified as much as the attended conditions. And so that's really interesting because, as I said in the beginning, the visual context, since it's spatially mapped out, I guess people are able to suppress out the representation in space a little bit better if they're told to zone out, quote unquote. Whereas in the auditory task, we see that the passive condition actually falls in between the attended and the ignored responses. So it's just pointing to the automaticity of the auditory system. Okay, so after all of this, that's great, but we really care about individual differences, right? And so we looked at each of these peaks on the individual level. So each individual, we calculated their peak, and we wanted to see if there was some correspondence to behavioral performance on the task. So just reminding you that there's an attend left condition and an attend right condition. And for the auditory context, where we're looking at the central channels, we found a significant correlation between the change in brain responses in an attended and ignored condition. So that could be attend left minus attend right, and the performance on the task. And that's really cool because it's identifying a brain behavior relationship, which is useful for us going forward. For the visual task, again, we're looking at left and right hemisphere separately. We didn't see the same correspondence at the individual level. So once again, we took the difference in the change in attention, the change in the N1 response based on attention and correlated it to performance, and we saw no correspondence in either of these. However, when we looked at the intertrial coherence, again, that phase consistency measure, in the auditory task, we saw no correspondence between the intertrial coherence when we're contrasting between the attended peaks and that passive baseline. But in the visual task, we saw strong correlations between that neural response and the performance on the task. And that's true for both the attend left condition and the attend right condition. And I won't get into it, but we hypothesized that maybe they would be different depending on if the person was attending left or right, and we don't see that difference. So this is really interesting. Let me summarize it for you so you can get it all. We use event-related potential N1 as a neural metric contrasting attended and ignored sounds. So that could be attend left minus attend right, or attend right minus attend left, depending on the trial type. And individual differences in that delta N1 predict selective attention performance. Whereas in the visual task, we use the intertrial coherence as our neurometric, and we contrasted attended and the passive condition, and we found that the individual differences in the ITC predict selective attention performance for that modality. So that's really cool. So answering the questions, did individuals perform similarly on the two tasks? Yes. Were their neurocorrelates or their brain signature similar? Yes, if you calculate them correctly. And one of the biggest take homes of this is that we really have to be careful with how we compute our neural correlates to make sure that we're picking up on the right activity. And will auditory and visual attention use a similar mechanism? Perhaps. We're not 100% sure which cognitive resources are engaged, but we know that we can do follow-up studies using MRI or some things that are more that look into the actual regions of the brain that are engaged a little bit more. And so, not to get too deep into the minutia of it, but the auditory system works great for the event-related potential. The visual system, due to interference due to oscillations, for instance, the alpha oscillation, probably made it so that the ERP couldn't work as well for it. And then when we used the intertrial coherence, it got rid of the contamination from uncorrelated alpha oscillations. That's what we're thinking. And we can talk about it later. Okay, but on to the next project because time is running out. We wanted to also compare spatial selective attention between ADHD and neurotypical young adults. And this idea came from my own life experiences and people close to me. I wondered if maybe my inattentiveness could have been due to an imbalance between top-down and bottom-up attention, or maybe there was something else going on. So I actually went and did a whole soul searching experience to understand myself through this project. So it's really near and dear to my heart. So what is ADHD? A lot of us know it as ADD, but in the newest DSM criteria, they're actually ADD and ADHD are combined, and there are different subtypes. You can be hyperactive or inattentive or have a combined version. And it's known to be a developmental disorder in children, but it persists into adulthood at a rate of about 60%. And the people who maybe don't get diagnosed soon enough end up having these awful comorbidities like depression and anxiety because they don't know what's going on. So for me, it's very important that we look into ADHD. I think it's a fascinating disorder. I think social media and the internet is exacerbating some of our issues and things. So it's just really an interesting thing. And so scientifically, instead of just colloquially, I had a few questions. So if we know that ADHD engages or is a disruption in certain parts of the brain, so the prefrontal cortex, the parietal cortex, which is known to be engaged in spatial attention, and all of these areas are, if they're implicated in ADHD and that affects top-down executive functioning, then does ADHD result in worse selective attention performance? Will neural correlates or the ERPs, the ITCs, reflect deficits in top-down attention? And do these deficits show up in adulthood? Will individual differences in performance on selective attention tasks be explained, in fact, by ADHD status? Maybe there are no individual differences. Maybe these are just people with ADHD. So we recruited young adults on and off the ADHD spectrum, 18 to 30 years old. This is not actual volunteers from the study. I just want to shout out my friends. And volunteers were to perform a spatial auditory attention task. We reported EEG, and we actually sent most of our subjects to the Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders at BU to characterize their everyday functioning. But I wanted to show the real numbers of who kind of made it through to the study. And it's just highlighting that working with a special population is hard. And even though this is a very high functioning, presumably high IQ, wealthy, white sample, this group of very privileged people, they still struggled with coming in after multiple visits. So we started off with around 100 volunteers, and we ended up with like 25 ADHD volunteers in the end. So just highlighting that it can be kind of difficult to do this work, even though it can be very fun. I had the best conversations with these subjects. It was incredible. Okay, so here was the task that we had them do. I call it the interrupter task or the switch attention task. And similar to the other task, there's a cue at the very beginning that says attend either focally or broad, and I'll tell you what that is later. They listen to some sounds, and then they have a response time. So they were told to attend to, to attend to a center stream, which will say ba, da, or ga in different permutations. And so in the focal condition, their task is to completely ignore the distractor here in blue. And if there's an interrupter, there's a chance that it comes on, completely ignore it. Just focus in, use focal attention on only that target ba, da, ga in whatever permutation. And then the broad attention or the switch condition is when they're listening to the target. So they are prepared to listen to the target and report back what they've heard. But if an interrupter comes, they should switch their attention, forget what they were listening to, whatever they stored in working memory in the target, and report back what they heard from the interrupter. And the interrupter comes at a rate of about 2/3. So every 2 out of 3 trials, there will be an interrupter, but the timing of it was staggered, so it wasn't predictable. And this is what it sounds like. Again, we're dealing with bas, das, and gas going at the same time, so you won't be able to actually do the task. because there's no spatial information on Zoom. But this is what it sounds like, and it's a little overwhelming. Kind of crazy. So shout out to Scott and his voice. But yes, this is what you're listening to. And this really makes you have to, because it's the exact same sound coming from different directions, you really have to listen into the spatial locations and use spatial selective attention to do the task. Okay. So this setup created 6 different trial types based on the 2 conditions, focal attention and broad. And then there are 3 interrupter types. Either there is no interrupter, and let's talk about the focal condition. Either there is no interrupter and you're not concerned about having to switch. There's an early interrupter where the interrupter comes on kind of in the middle of when you were listening to the target stream. And then there's one where the interrupter comes in so late in the trial that you've already stored in memory and you finish listening to the main thing, and it doesn't matter what comes after. In the broad attention condition, which again is a little trickier, once again, there's this version, and the people don't know ahead of time which of the interrupters they're going to get. In broad attention, they're preparing to switch, but the switch never comes. So they're just listening into the target, and maybe that something comes, but it doesn't. In the early interrupter, they are in the middle of listening. So maybe 2 of these sounds come by, but then they have to switch. So it's complete disruption. And then in the late interrupter case, they've already committed everything to memory. And now the second interrupter comes, they just discard what they were remembering and they report back what they hear from the interrupter. And so we're going to focus in on this early interrupter case simply because it was the most challenging version of the task because this interruption comes in the middle. And it really requires the individuals to use their selective attention to allocate attention appropriately and switch flexibly. And there's true physical overlap between the stimuli instead of them being completely separated. So behavioral performance on all the trial types. We found that there was no significant difference between the neurotypical and ADHD subjects in performance, which was not quite what we expected. We expected people with ADHD to do worse on the task. And it turns out that in every single version of the interrupter, the broad attention condition, so when they're preparing to switch or they successfully switch, that condition was harder for everyone. And this is interesting, especially in this first no interrupter case, because remember, let me just show you, remember, the interrupter doesn't even come on. So just telling the individuals to prepare to switch their attention leads to a hit in performance. And that's what you can see in this first kind of column for both the neurotypical and ADHD subjects. And so we thought that was really interesting. But again, we wanted to look at EEG responses, the actual brain responses. Hopefully I'm not going too quickly, but I think it's in my best interest. Okay, so the neural responses. Again, we're focusing in on the early interrupter case where they're listening to the central target stream and then they have to switch their attention. Either they don't switch their attention in the focal condition or they do in the broad. So I'm showing all of the EEG traces for the focal condition in blue and black and the the broad attention in red. And this is our evoking event. So this is the time of the first early interrupter. So the ba in this example. So this is the time of that first interrupter. And as you all know now, because you're ERP experts, the first N1 response, so there should be an N1 response 100 milliseconds after that, that sound. So it's an evoking stimulus, so you get a potential. And that's what we saw in control subjects. Can everyone see? Oh yeah, you all can see it, but I can't see it. Okay, so we see in this first 100 millisecond region a negativity in the broad attention condition. And we also saw a P3A response. So that's a positivity that comes usually 300 milliseconds or so after the evoking stimulus, this red line. And it's formerly known to be a surprise stimulus. And this makes sense because as you're listening to this sound, there's a surprise interrupter that came at this random onset. And so it evokes this surprise response. So that kind of made sense to us, even though we didn't expect to see it. And in the control subjects, you can see that when the person is basically ignoring that interrupter, right? They're attending focally to the other central response. You see a little bit of an N1, maybe a little bit of a P3 response, but it's far more enhanced when the person is actually attending to that interrupter, meaning they switch their attention in the broad case. So I don't know if that's super clear, but we see an enhancement of the N1 and the P3 when subjects were attending to that stimulus. With the ADHD subjects, we did not see this same attention modulation. And that was really interesting to us because it's showing that control subjects have true control over their attention in a way that the ADHD subjects, they're letting every sound through equally, okay? And this, to our knowledge, is the first time we've seen that the P3A response is actually modulated by attention. In the literature, it's known to only change with the stimulus properties. Say we make the sound, instead of it being a cat meow, it's a cow mooing or something. If it's a surprise, it'll change, but we've never seen it modulating based on attention. So we quantified these findings, and we see that neurotypical folks show different brain responses to the different cued attention states. And we saw that indeed neurotypical subjects attentionally modulate their neural responses, so that difference here, more than the ADHD subjects. So this represents the N1 response, that negativity, and that interaction is significant. And then for the P3A response, it wasn't quite significant. It was at a p-value of 0.06, so almost there. But as we've been discussing, we were interested in individual differences that are reflected in the neural response. So let's talk about individual differences. We actually saw, so let me orient you to the axes. So we took, again, the difference between the focal and broad attention. So that's this difference at the N1 and at the P3 as our neural response, and we correlated it to performance and saw significant correlations for both the N1 and the P3A. And this is really exciting. Again, we're seeing that brain behavior correspondence, and we're seeing that ADHD and control subjects are pretty interspersed. Like, yes, these box plots here kind of quantify there is a bit of a separation, but those are not significant, whereas the individual differences are significant. So we're seeing that the individual differences are actually stronger than the group differences in this case. That's really interesting. So our takeaways. So we identified individual differences in this challenging listening task. Multiple ERP components were modulated by attention, including the N1, which we knew would probably modulate with top-down attention, and the P3A, which is previously known to only modulate with bottom-up I don't know what the word is, bottom-up contributions. So perceptual load, for example, is one of those. We found that people with ADHD modulate neural responses less than neurotypical adults. And this is different from what we expected. We thought performance would show that difference, but actually the brain responses did. And individuals' neural responses correlate to task performance significantly in a way that's more drastic than our expected group differences. And that's really cool. So questions, answers. Does ADHD result in worse selective attention performance? Not on this particular task. And maybe we could create a task that would be more sensitive and show performance differences. Perhaps ADHD people have better coping mechanisms. Do neural correlates of selective attention point to deficits in top-down attention? Yes, N1 modulation reflects that task performance. And do these deficits show up in ADHD into adulthood? Yes. So we saw that the ADHD group had those weaker neural responses than their control counterparts. And are individual differences explained by ADHD status? And the answer is not really. But they do, there's a slight separation, but it's a weak correspondence. And that's pretty interesting and worth exploring further. So here's some scientific conclusions and future directions before I get into the next part of the talk. Questions answered. Are there individual differences in spatial selective attention, even with normal hearing and eyesight? Yes, we saw this in both tasks. Are mechanisms of selective attention different across sensory modalities, for example, between auditory and visual context? Maybe we need to look at the true mechanisms through other follow-up studies. And does the attention deficit of ADHD actually affect selective attention performance in a controlled laboratory environment? Um, and I'm sorry, brain fart. um, yes, no, maybe. We're saying perhaps. And again, this is this new frontier in, I think, cognitive science, where we have to look at the difference between individual differences in certain cognitive domains. So attention is one of them, but we could also look at working memory and all sorts of others, and group differences between people who are labeled neurotypical or ADHD. What am I doing? What is the next thing? Oh, okay. So what are the future directions? Why do we care about this? So I've already explained that I think the future is this precision medicine and really looking at spectra of functioning. But there are some pretty practical things that are going on that I might not necessarily be involved in, but are exciting to the field. So there's all sorts of perceptual technologies that are being developed based on our knowledge of selective attention, and especially spatial selective attention. So there's augmented reality, virtual reality, and being able to actually present sounds in a way that the brain will really respond to, or being able to have some feedback where your brain can be looked at, and the brain machine interface can know where you are attending in space just by your brain waves. There's spatial hearing aids that need to be developed. Currently, hearing aids increase the level of all sounds. So if there's a rustling bag in the background or a TV or something, all of that gets enhanced, and that can be very annoying to people with hearing aids, which is why sometimes they just turn them off. People with them just turn them off. So spatial hearing aid could enhance, again, the spatial location of the person who you're really trying to attend to, even if you're just trying to drown out, you know, someone who you don't want to listen to. There's military enhancement, and I included this example because not because I actually am a promoter of this, but this is what's happening. We're thinking of different technologies that can help in all sorts of military applications, and that's kind of mind blowing. That's why I put the emoji there. And then obviously personal enhancement. We are in a land of Neuralink and all sorts of neurotech startups, and who knows what we can do to just better enhance ourselves going into the future. And so it's really exciting to see all of this. It's exciting to see my colleagues work on these things. I mean, on this slide alone are like 3 or 4 of my colleagues who've helped me through this program. And it's exciting to see my friends work at Bose and Apple and all of these kind of consumer technology places as well. So very fun. All right, running out of time. Let's talk about increasing diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice in STEM education and practice. So this is something that I've been thinking and doing work for a long time. I see some people on the call who are from my high school, actually, which was my first step into these intense math and science worlds. I went to a competitive math and science boarding school for high school, which got me thinking about this. And there's really 3 main pillars that I like to think about when it comes to the solution to some of our problems in terms of marginalized groups. So first is diversity, like providing marginalized scholars exposure and access to STEM spaces, to academia, to higher education. Inclusion, which would be supporting these marginalized scholars through to graduation. So once you get the students on campus, do they persist? And then the justice of it all. Are we not using, but are we getting marginalized scholars to to promote their intellectual contribution? Are we promoting their intellectual contributions, and are we bringing them into the room where the big decisions are made? So I'm going to fly through this, unfortunately, but I'm happy to talk to anyone about any of these later. Okay, and I'm giving one example of each of these because I've actually done quite a bit of work surrounding all this. So let's talk about the E3 mentoring program. So I was the national director of E3, which stands for Empowering, Encouraging, and Eliminating Barriers. It was founded by a high schooler, a Black girl from from Cambridge Public Schools. And she recruited me to, and a bunch of mentors to come and do some outreach with these kids. So I ended up being the director of E3. It's a one-on-one mentoring program between high schoolers and college students. And every year we had from 10 to 20 high schoolers who were paired and matched to scholars at Boston University, Northeastern, Harvard, MIT, all sorts of colleges. And it was really about teaching the access of college, applying, getting financial aid, studying for SATs. We did weekly field trips and we had talks from professional women. We had demonstrations. We had them building video games using fruit as a circuit. We went to see the Cancer Research Center at MIT. We did all sorts of things to expose them to a scientific field, but also to give them access. So beyond just look at how cool science is, we really sat down and worked with them on their resume, worked with them on their elevator pitch, how to interview, how to call up the financial aid director and, kind of fend for yourself. And a lot of these girls were first generation, low income public school students. And so this really was an impactful thing. We met every week at the Microsoft New England Research and Development building, which overlooked the Charles River. So we gave them this sense of pride, like I belong in this space. And in the end, it was very impactful. 100% of our girls went on to college. And the majority of them, I think, I don't have the data in yet. We have a survey out at the moment. But I think like upwards of 80% of them went into STEM or health related fields. And many of them returned as mentors since they went to college in the area. So I like to talk about one girl in particular. She emailed me this summer saying she was matriculating at BU in the BME PhD program, which was the program that I was in when we met. So so proud of her, and she's going to definitely promote and help women of color going forward. And even one of our mentors, the mentors learned a lot too, because as a grad student, I could mentor them directly. One of them is in her first year at Johns Hopkins PhD program. So I'm just so thankful for this group of people, but it's just one example of how having a hands-on approach to getting girls and girls of color to and through higher education, it's really an all-encompassing thing, and we need to do a better job of it in academia. So that's diversity, getting diverse bodies. Then how do we keep people here once we're there? So I walked into Boston University in 2014, and I was the one sole Black PhD student in the entire College of Engineering. And I actually looked up the stats on it, and I kind of was like, well, there was DeMarcus, but like the numbers say that in the PhD department, in the PhD program for the College of Engineering alone, I was the only one. So it's not that I was isolated because I had tons of friends and people, but it's weird to be the only person of color a lot of times, the only woman of color a lot of times, and of course, always the only Black woman in a room. It's a lot. So I actually sent out a survey to the 900 underrepresented minority graduate students at the university. 220 people replied, and we did a survey and a focus group to see, were we all feeling the same isolation? And indeed, yes, everyone said we need more social activities. We need a way to promote our scholarship. We need a community. And we created the the underrepresented graduate student organization because of these needs. And it's grown and grown over the years. We had welcome events. We had the Dean of Students buying into these programs. And it's really gone on to flourish. And I'd like to shout out Michael and Luis, who've kept it going. I think they're both in this picture somewhere. And it's grown. And I want to emphasize that these programs on campus are not just in existence to have a social outlet only. It's really to also promote our intellectual, our actual work, right? So Luis and Michael, who are now the co-presidents of this organization, have created an academic symposium for graduate students of color. And that's really impactful and amazing because not only is it a new CV line for these students, it's just showing that Black and Latinx and Indigenous scholars have something to say, and it's worth listening to. And so I'm just so proud of them. And the second annual uh, research symposium is coming up, and I'll be doing the keynote. So I'm really grateful and thankful for that community. And I'm so grateful that at Carnegie Mellon, I didn't have to start one because there was already a Black graduate student organization. Amen. And then finally, once you've gotten to college and gotten through college, I mean, is your voice even heard in the room where it happens? So I've been thinking a lot, and I think in the popular media, we've talked a lot about racial bias and consumer tech and in medicine and all these places. So this says wearables still haven't solved the problems of skin science, but new ideas are coming. There's even evidence that skin conductance recording, which looks at like fear conditioning, doesn't even work on African Americans. So the conclusion is that has been that African Americans aren't as fearful because our response doesn't. I mean, it's crazy. And there's so many examples of this. And so one example that is near and dear to my heart is actually out of the lab of my committee member, Dr. Grover, where he and my good friend Arnel Etienne, brilliant scholar, created a EEG system and braiding system that takes advantage of the coarse and curliness of Black hair to, I lost my train of thought. Look at this hair, it's so beautiful. A system using braiding and a novel electrode to collect reliable EEG. So there's so many issues in neurotechnology, medicine, artificial intelligence, where had there been a Black inventor in the room, these things would have been thought about, or these things would have been at least started in the research and development process. But because of these biases in who gets into the room and who gets through and to and through higher education and into academia, we don't have people who are mindful of this. And so it's up to the consumer to say, hey, this doesn't work for me. Even my Apple Watch, it doesn't know when I'm standing up to this day. And it's so frustrating because I want to close my ring and it never closes because I never get the stand goal. Sorry, that was a little personal. But these are very important technical issues. And they exist in both clinical and research grade tech. And it just perpetuates bias. And I think we need to really start talking about these issues, calling a spade, and then working to get people to getting our non-Black allies to work on our behalf, but also put Black people in the room to work on it. So I'm just going to leave you all with a few questions that I was going to put up, but let's just look at this beautiful illustration and I'll ask the questions. Who is allowed to participate in STEM discovery? What resources are needed to succeed in academia and in the professoriate for people of color, gender minorities, and people from low socioeconomic levels? And we can even extend this to people with disabilities and people who are non-gender conforming. How does investment in marginalized groups actually lead to the creation of innovative, inclusive technologies? And how does diversity help us to conduct equitable science? And I would encourage anyone who's a science practitioner on this call to think about that within your own groups and within your own practice. And for the rest of us who are trying to get there, keep pushing because we have a lot to say to change this world. So here are some concluding thoughts. Oh my gosh, it's done, it's over. I'm a little over time, but I'm just going to blow through it. So I won the NIH F99K00 award, which is basically funding for my last couple of years of grad school, which came in handy because this has been a 7-year process. And the K award is for up to 4 years of postdoctoral funds. So I'm going to activate it at Carnegie Mellon and work with Barb and Polka and maybe even some other people. We're still figuring it out. And I don't know 100% what I'll be doing, but I am excited about inclusive neurotech development. That could be EEG, optical technologies, and skin conductance testing, exploring kind of follow-ups to my PhD work, looking at top-down attentional effects on the P3A response in particular. I want to do some type of replication and an extension of that. I'm interested in alternating current stimulation. So seeing if we can either enhance or disrupt spatial attention using injecting current into the brain, so having more of a causal understanding of that mechanism. And high density EEG, which has been shown in Dr. Grover's lab to have promising, it seems to be promising to get a clearer signal of what's going on in the brain, even though EEG is non-invasive. And I'll just say for the record, I'm committed to writing and speaking about neuroethics, mentoring young women and underrepresented minorities in STEM, and changing the way we do science from the recruiting stage to the designing of technologies and on. So with that, my scientific acknowledgements are the lab in multisensory neuroscience and Carnegie Mellon, Boston University, Barb, of course, and my undergraduate research assistant who did a lot of the work on the ADHD project, Laura Torres, who is going to medical school this fall. I'm so proud of her. I'd like to thank the F99K00 DSPAN Award and the community that I've gotten from them, the Society for Neuroscience Scholars Program, the NSF-GRFP, and the Ford Foundation Predoctoral Fellowship. And these are all awards that I've applied to, and thankfully I've won. Thanks, Mom, for your prayers, because they really work out. And of course, the indigenous owners of the land where I did all of this work in Boston and Pittsburgh. So it is 12:35, or I guess 1:35. Barb, is it okay if I spend like 6-7 minutes going through personal?
This is your day. You got
Okay.
6 minutes.
Okay, I'm gonna go through my personal acknowledgements. Woo! I'm actually not gonna cry because I feel pretty good.